Hello, welcome to video 1. Typically we won't shoot our videos like this for Mr. Hartberger's and Ms. Maddox's classes, but today we are doing something a little bit different. So today's topic is about properties and changes in chemistry, and this is video 1. So basically there are two types of properties that we discuss in chemistry. We'll talk about the properties first, then we'll talk about the changes. So those two types of properties are our physical properties and our chemical properties. Physical properties can be observed without changing the identity of a substance, so its chemical formula stays exactly the same. Have some examples of those for you. So some examples include states of matter. We can observe the state of matter of a substance without changing it. So for instance, is it a liquid? Is it a solid? Is it a gas? We could take its temperature or look at its color. We could look at how firm it is, or its hardness, as we call it in chemistry. We could even measure its melting point and boiling point, or calculate its density. And there's a lot more properties as well. Now, in terms of chemical properties, those are the ones that describe a substance's ability to participate in chemical reactions. So in other words, it's how does it interact with other stuff, okay? Some key examples of those are things like flammability and combustibility, which are different. One is, can it burn? The other is, will it blow stuff up? A lot of times those two things are, they happen at the same time, or they happen in the same substance. Does it have the ability to react with something specific? Like, does it react with oxygen to, say, form rust? Or does it react with light? A good example of that is the stuff in my glasses, for instance, that get dark in the sunlight. The things that are used to develop film, traditional film, and not digital media. Or even why hydrogen peroxide is kept in a brown bottle. All of those things have to do with the chemical properties of those substances. So we're done with chemical properties, and now we're going to talk about the two types of changes we often see in chemistry. Now, the first type of change we tend to see is a physical change, and the second type is a chemical change. Physical changes, when those things happen, the identity of the substance stays the same, but the form changes. Some examples of those are things like phase changes. So when we're talking about boiling and melting, sublimation, all of those phase changes are examples of physical changes. If I dissolve something in water, like say salt or sugar, if I crush it or cut it or tear it, all of those are examples of physical changes. I've changed the form of a substance, but I haven't changed the actual chemical makeup of the substance. Water is still water, whether I freeze it or boil it, whether I crush the ice or not, it is still water. The last thing to discuss is chemical changes. When you talk about chemical changes, the identity of the substance changes, and there are new formulas that are involved. So our symbolic changes, as well as our microscopic, or rather submicroscopic. So some of the evidence that we have of those changes: first, it produces a gas. When it produces a gas, oftentimes we'll see bubbles. Like, for instance, when you put hydrogen peroxide on the cut and you see bubbles, or when you mix baking soda and vinegar and you see bubbles. That's an example of a chemical change. If it forms a precipitate is a scientific chemistry word for a solid out of nowhere, or a solid when you mix two liquids together and you suddenly get a solid, or you mix two liquids together and you suddenly it's pretty much always two liquids and a solid in your experience of chemistry. When it releases or absorbs energy. When something releases energy, the container that it's in feels hot. And when something absorbs energy, the container that it's in feels cold. So if you're doing a chemical reaction and it suddenly gets hot when you mix two substances together, or it suddenly gets cold, that's an example of a chemical change. That's not to be confused with boiling, say, water, because you added heat to it in order to get that reaction to occur. And so, of course, it's going to feel warm. But if you just randomly mix two things at room temperature together and you don't add any heat to it and it suddenly gets warm, or you do the opposite, you add two things together and it gets cold, that's an example of an indication anyway that there was a chemical change. Last but certainly not least, a color change during a reaction. Now this color change is kind of one that is surprising, okay? So if I mix yellow and red, I'm expecting to get orange. That's not a surprise. But if I mix yellow and red together and I get blue, that's an indication that a chemical change has occurred. Hopefully throughout the week we'll give you a chance to see a couple of those different types of reactions. Okay, that's it for the first video. If you didn't take notes on what was said as well as what was written down, you want to pause this video and go back and rewatch it. Make sure that you're taking notes on both what is said and also what is being written in words out in front of you. Thanks so much and see you in class.